With that, once again, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to this webinar on how to prethink assumptions. My name is Rajat Surana. I am one of the co-founders of e-GMAT, and I'm going to be your main host today. Supporting me in this webinar is Sandeep. Sandeep is a GMAT strategy expert and has been with e-GMAT for upwards of 4 years. This is a fairly application-focused webinar. In this webinar, we just focus on one key skill, which is helping you build that ability to pre-think. Uh, and the reason why we focus on just spend a couple of hours learning just one key skill is because the skill of pre-thinking is a very foundational skill. It helps you answer not just assumption questions, but also evaluate, strengthen, weaken, and we extend this even to bold-faced questions. So to make sure that you're able to apply the concepts that we're going to discuss in this webinar, we did send a few video lessons your way. The two video lessons that I really wanted you to watch is an introduction to assumption, which is the top left-hand corner, and then the pre-thinking logical gap. If you've gone through those two video lessons, then you are all set for this webinar. You should be able to understand everything that we talk about in this webinar, and go take the next 2-3 steps in that journey towards becoming a skilled pre-thinker. If you've not gone through these video lessons are a part of your free trial. So make sure when you log into the to your e-GMAT account next time, you go through them. They'll help cement your understanding, extend what you learned today in this webinar, and add a couple of paces to your journey to pre-thinking. With that, we also have a few upcoming free webinars. We have a free webinar on algebra tomorrow. Again, the theme of that webinar is very similar to what it is, the theme of today's webinar, in which we'll look at how to apply some fundamental concepts in algebra, primarily in inequalities and absolute value, to solve, starting with the easiest to the most challenging questions. Inequalities happens to be a topic that many people struggle with, and what we will demonstrate is if you just know the basic concepts well, and if you apply a systematic approach, we have a systematic approach to solving questions, or what we call as a unified approach, you can solve the easiest to the most challenging questions. Then we have a GMAT strategy webinar. GMAT scores for B schools have been going up. And in this webinar, we look at how do you plan your GMAT strategy. If you want to get to a score of 740 or higher, then how do you understand which are the areas that you need to focus on, and how do you track your improvement as you learn those areas, not just by taking mocks, but even while studying. Every 30 minutes of your preparation, how do you track whether you've learned something properly? With that, this is a free webinar, and it's fairly heavily attended. So to make sure that we understand the pulse of this group, we ask a couple of leading questions. One of them is, when do you plan to take the test? The next one is, what's your target GMAT score? Based on the data that I see over here on the top, in the poll in the top left-hand corner, what I really see is that the biggest group over here is those who have their exam in 46 to 75 days. Presumably, you guys are planning for round 2 applications. Other than that, we have 4 almost equally sized groups. We have a few folks who have their exam right away, a few who have within a couple of weeks to a month, and then a few who haven't taken the data as of yet. And with regards to the target GMAT scores, the biggest group, which is actually a surprise to me, is the 710, 720 group. We have close to 45% of you who are aiming for a score of 730 or higher, and 14% who are aiming for a score of 760 or higher. It's kind of very interesting how, and I had the same poll a month back in July for the same webinar, and the number of, or the percentage of people who are aiming for scores of 730 or higher was much higher. As we get closer to round 1 deadlines, I think that's where people take more mocks, and they start to get a bit more realistic. But nevertheless, fairly ambitious group. 48% of you are aiming for that score of 730 or higher right now. Okay, with that, let's go into the webinar pane. The screen will have, or will be in the process of changing for you. When the screen does change, you should be seeing the title slide which says CR1, Pre-thinking for Assumptions. Let's get in a poll question. How many of you can see that title slide? All right, pretty much everyone can. That's wonderful. Um, if you still cannot, again, the solution to most problems with Adobe Connect, if you are having an issue, is just reboot, get to the join link again, and as you launch it again, you should be able to come right into this. Okay. All right. So with that, let's move forward. There are essentially three parts to this webinar. In the first part, I'm going to give you a brief introduction to e-GMAT. That's going to be about 12 minutes. In the next part, we're going to go into the core of this webinar, where we'll look at pre-thinking. It's going to be about 2 hours, and then towards the end, we're going to go towards an open-ended Q&A. So with that, let's start with that introduction. So early on, I asked this question, what's your target GMAT score? And in the 730 bracket or higher, you had about 47, 48% of the class. While that is true, one thing that I can tell you is that only 6% of the people get to those scores. And this is despite the fact that if you look at median scores reported this year at schools such as Tuck and Columbia, they keep on going up. So this data is from last year. This year, the median scores have gone even higher overall. So, so what does this mean? I mean, what is it that people who get to that score of 720 or higher do? When you look at stats overall, what you're going to find is that a good percentage of them use e-GMAT. Why do we say that? When you look at two different stats, one is the number of verified reviews. The second is the number of success stories that in the last 12 months. What you're going to find is that if you look at major forums, more people review e-GMAT than do review any other prep company, and they talk about the success stories and verified reviews. Pretty much every verified review is verified using an actual score report. And then if you look at the number of success stories, you're going to find a very similar picture, or you're going to see a very similar picture. More people mention e-GMAT than do all of the other major prep companies combined. So why is it that our students are more successful than students from other prep companies, or what makes our courses more effective? I think there's one thing that makes our courses more effective is how we think about your GMAT preparation, or what we call as the architecture of the learning that we provide. So when you think about architectures of learning and you try and compare those, what you're going to find is that there are two dominant architectures of learning that exist today. One is what we call as the book-based architecture, and the second is the private tutoring-based architecture. Okay. When you compare most of the courses and map them to one of these two architectures, what you're going to find is even though these courses provide audio-visual instruction, even though they have quizzes and exercises and mocks, their core learning architecture, their core feedback architecture is modeled around this book-based approach. When you look at e-GMAT and map it to one of these two architectures, what you're going to find is that e-GMAT's built around this private tutoring-based architecture. And to understand why one architecture is more effective than the other in helping you ace the GMAT, let's see how do you get to that 720 score. So regardless of where you're starting from, if you want to get to that 720 score, the first thing that you need to do is to create that customized path towards your goal. You need to figure out what your strengths are, what your weaknesses are, what are the areas where you need to spend time on improving, and how much time do you need to spend. You need to get that estimate in that first step. Then you need to learn the concepts that you don't know. Just knowing the concepts isn't enough. You also need to learn how to apply those concepts. After all, on the test, they test you on questions and they don't really ask you to regurgitate concepts. And then you need to get so good at applying those concepts that you attain a level of mastery that's superior to others. So that's amongst the top 3%, top 4 percentile of students who take the test. Now, that's the challenge. Now let's see how a book-based approach addresses these challenges. I mean, there are multiple challenges over here, starting with creating that personalized path towards your goal. So when you think about a book-based approach, it's all about autonomy. So when you start studying using a book, you'll get probably a couple of study plans, one quant focus and the other one verbal focus, and you'll have to really follow one of those study plans and start learning those. A book-based approach gives the same estimate to every student who follows a particular study plan. So then you start learning and you learn concepts. And now books are a really good source of learning concepts with regards to, they're very comprehensive. with regards to what they teach. But the problem with books is when 1,000 people go through a chapter in a book, they learn to 1,000 different degrees, and books don't give you feedback as to whether you've learned to a degree that's optimum for you to move to that next chapter or do the exercises or not. And this burden of validation in that book-based approach is completely on the student. So after learning a few concepts, you start to solve questions. And one area where books truly struggle with because of their static nature is teaching you how to apply those concepts. Why? Because uh, just when you see a problem in a book, you're going to be hard pressed to find a solution of the format that tells you this is what you do in step one, this is what you do in step two, this is what you do in step three. Or when you take a quiz, you'd be hard pressed to find an architecture that will tell you you made a mistake because you faltered in step one, step two, or step three. Uh, and so a lot of people who study using books, they resort to answering hundreds and hundreds of questions. They resort to going to forums, and a few of them are able to master this, but only after spending an enormous amount of time. And when it comes to evaluation of mastery, people who follow the book-based approach uh, resort to taking mock tests. And when you take a mock test, that onus of evaluation again is completely on student to get that specific insight out of that mock test to understand what do you do next, so that you get that next 30, next 50-point improvement is some completely onto you. A private tutoring based architecture works very differently. If you work with a good private tutor, the first thing that a good private tutor would do is to create a personalized study plan where a private tutor would understand your strengths, understand your weaknesses, the extent of those weaknesses, and allocate time so that you can make those weaknesses or overcome those weaknesses and leverage those strengths. Then a good private tutor will teach you concepts that you don't know. And as you're learning those concepts, he'll constantly evaluate you and give feedback on areas that you still need to reinforce. One area where a private tutoring based architecture works really, really well is when it comes to application of concepts. A private tutor would tell you what do you need to do in step one, what do you need to do in step two and step three. And when you make a mistake, it'll pinpoint where you made a mistake and which step and get to the cause of it. And when it comes to evaluation of mastery, as you're solving more and more questions, the private tutor would evaluate how well you've learned that particular topic, and then it'll tell you when is it time for you to move from, let's say, SC to CR or number properties to arithmetic, number properties to algebra or word problems or so on and so forth. So what's the difference between these two approaches? While you learn the same content, a private tutor-based approach is a lot more personalized, starting from the study plans, has a lot more feedback, and has a lot more focus on application and hitting those milestones. So let's see, why do we really say that most of these other courses are built around this book-based approach, whereas e-GMAT's built around this private tutoring-based architecture. To do that, we're going to take a case study of a student who wants to go from a score of 600 to a 720. Not a small improvement, not a super high improvement of a 250, like a 250-point improvement or so, but a 120-point improvement, fairly significant. So the first step in this entire process is to define a path to your goal. So how do you define a path to your goal? The first thing that you need to do is quantify where you currently are, then figure out how will you get to that 720 score, and then personalize the learning such that you only focus on areas where you need the most help from. So how do you quantify your starting abilities? What you do is you take a sigma x mock test. What is a sigma x mock test? It's an e-GMAT mock test in which we tell you your starting scores in CR, SC, and RC, as well as arithmetic and algebra. We give you feedback on your test taking skills, and we tell you to what extent do you need to learn. Then you need to set milestones to get to that 720 score. How do you go about doing that? We built an AI-driven planner called GMAT Planner that allows everyone to build their personalized study plan in 7 minutes or fewer. Let's see how this planner works. So it takes the output of that sigma x mock and it'll take your current quant and verbal scores in. So let's say you are at 600 with a key 44 and a V28. It'll take that input in and it'll tell you how would you get to a 720. Now, How does it do that? It looks at upwards of 10 paths to get into that 720 score and recommends the shortest and the most likely path for you. Now, if you don't like this recommendation, you can change it, and it'll adjust its recommendations, future recommendations accordingly. And you can do that by pressing this button. Then it can look at and really say, hey, your target quant scores are is Q50. How do you get to a Q50? You get an 83rd percentile in arithmetic and algebra. What is the most likely way for you to get to a V38? You get to these abilities in SCCR and RC. And GMAT Planner gets all of these insights from the thousands of score reports that we have, and it essentially runs an AI engine over it to give you this input. Now, what's the next thing that it does? It then creates your customized study plan based on your starting abilities in quant and verbal, and your target abilities in quant and verbal. And what you see over here, let me just move this over. What you see over here is that in arithmetic, you need to go from a 59 percentile to an 83rd percentile. In sentence correction, you need to go from a 50th percentile to an 89th percentile. So when this happens, your overall GMAT preparation becomes a set of 5 different milestones. When you're studying this, you're studying to hit those milestones, and it then estimates the amount of time that you need to achieve those scores. And again, it gives you this view where it lists your starting abilities, it lists your target milestones. It also lists how much time it thinks you can get to those milestones. So in this case, in arithmetic, it thinks given the number of hours per day you can put in on weekdays as well as on weekends, you'll need about 1.4 weeks. In SC, you'll need about 2.1 weeks. Again, it takes into account how much studying you do. If you put in 6 hours a day, this number will likely shrink a lot more. So when this happens, your personalized GMAT preparation is a set of 5 neat milestones, and you study to get to those milestones. It then generates a calendar view for you, which tells you when should you study what. Again, you can really see your starting date, ending date, number of hours that you're putting on weekdays and weekends. So why did we spend 1,000+ hours building this utility? So that each one of you can create your personalized study plan in 7 minutes or less. The next thing the private tutor does is it makes sure that you learn the concepts properly. And as you're learning concepts, a private tutor gives you feedback on how well you're doing that. The e-GMAT learning architecture, as well as our video engines designed to do just that. Here's a screenshot of our subject verb module. What you really see is that you have these video lessons over here in which we teach the fundamentals of subject verb. And each of these video lessons has a built-in assessment that gives you feedback that is personalized to you. These are the assessments over here. This time that you see over here is the amount of time that you've spent learning and reviewing your answers over there. Now, how does this compare to any other course? All of this is within the video. This quizzing is within the video, so you don't leave the environment. You're still within that learning mode. So how does this compare to some of the other online courses out there? There's a very popular course by Magoosh, and again, what you really see is, yes, you have video lessons in subject verb over here, but there's no tracking, there's no feedback in there. This length, this timing that you really see is the length of the video. It's not the time that you spent learning that video. The next thing that a private tutor does is it teaches you how to apply those concepts. When you after you've learned those concepts, if you see a question, how do you approach it in step 1, step 2, and step 3? And to do that, we built a specific entity called an application file. In an application file, we teach you exactly that. Then we evaluate you right then and there on your ability to apply those concepts, not just on e-GMAT questions, but also on selected official questions. So the key over here is you learn something, you get feedback on that right then and there. And by doing that, you ensure that you're moving forward only when you've learned something properly. And this is how every module, whether it's a quant or a verbal module, in the e-GMAT portal is architected. When you again compare this with the Magoosh course, what you're going to find is that yes, there are some video lessons, but there's no focus on there's no specific application file that teaches you how to apply those concepts. There is one quiz in the end, but this quiz is common not just to subject verb over here, but also to auxiliary verbs and pronouns. The last piece in this is evaluation of mastery. You've been learning sentence correction for some time. You need to know whether you've learned it well enough to hit that 90th percentile or not that you were aiming for. To do that, what we have is a tool called Scholarium. It's actually GMAT Club's highest rated assessment engine. In Scholarium, you have this entity called Ability Quizzes. So after you've studied sentence correction, you can take an SC ability quiz. It'll give you an ability score. It'll also give you analytics as to which area do you need to do work on. So in this case, it's very clear that this student needs to work on comparison. Now, the beauty of this architecture is the student can go back to the comparisons module in the SC course, revise this, come back, take another ability quiz, and track his or her improvement. So you can really see, why do we say that most of the other courses are built around this book-based approach, whereas e-GMAT is architected around this private tutoring-based architecture? Who's created this architecture and the content that goes behind it? 4 out of GMAT Club's top 5 rated instructors have done that. Instructors who have more reviews per faculty than instructors from any other prep company, and this includes your Manhattan and Veritas preps of the world. So that's why we say while only 6% of the people get to that 720 score or higher, a good percentage of them use e-GMAT. With that, I've come to the end of my introduction. If you want to stay updated with all things e-GMAT, if you want to stay updated with most of the things that go on in the B-School world, you're welcome to connect with me on my LinkedIn. Right now, I think I have upwards of 13,000 students connected with me on my LinkedIn. We share about we write about 5 articles every week and share them on my LinkedIn profile. With that, let's go to the second part of this webinar, which is how to pre-think assumptions. It's going to be for about another 2 hours or so. So in this part, we're going to follow this agenda. We're going to start about discussing how you currently solve CR questions. Then we'll do a pre-thinking exercise and we'll take on 2 arguments over here. And these would just be arguments without any choices. Our goal really would be to look at those arguments, understand the conclusion, understand the structure of the argument, and pre-think. Then we'll do actually not 2, but for this session, we'll do 3 full-length questions. Each of these 3 questions is an official question. We'll do them as a quiz. We'll do a detailed review of these questions. We'll actually apply pre-thinking as well as the negation test. And then we'll look at where do you go next? What should be your approach? So how can you go from where you are today to becoming a skilled pre-thinker, and where can you get more practice? So at a very high level, we'll document how you prepare today. Then we'll recognize how can you learn, what are the key steps to becoming a skilled pre-thinker, and we'll present your should be plan to master assumptions. Okay. With that, let's discuss your current approach to critical reasoning. Let me just put in a poll over here. That's what it is. Before we do that, let me make sure I define clearly what pre-thinking is. Pre-thinking is thinking of one potential assumption in your mind in 15 seconds before looking at the answer choices. And then the 3 items in quotes are really, really important. When it comes to pre-thinking, we are not worried about thinking of all potential assumptions. We only worry about getting to that one assumption in our mind. A skilled pre-thinker is able to do this in 15 seconds, and you do this before you look at the answer choices. Once you start looking at the answer choices, you can throw pre-thinking out of the window. I also want to tell you that pre-thinking is a term. It's a fairly old term. People have talked about pre-thinking since for the last 20 years, but it's often confused with predicting the answer. With pre-thinking, we are merely trying to make sure that we understand the gist of the argument. Pre-thinking is not predicting the answer. Okay. And that's something that I want to make sure that you understand this, because as you read other texts, you're going to find that pre-thinking is equated to predicting the answer. Now, that's not what we are trying to do. We are trying to come up with one potential assumption. The assumption that we come up with may not be the one that you see in the answer choices, but regardless of that, if you come up with one potential assumption, as soon as you see another potential assumption, you'd be able to spot it and select it right away. We were the first company to come up with this precise definition of pre-thinking. And every solution that we have follows this approach. Okay, so with that, let's understand how do you how do you solve CR questions today? There are two ways in which people approach CR questions. Tell me, which methodology do you follow? All right, let's get a few more responses. The first methodology is you read the argument, you look at the answer choices, and you come back to the argument till you reach the final candidate. The second methodology is you read the argument, you think about an assumption, and then you start looking at the answer choices. I have about 130 odd students in the webinar. I just have 67 responses, guys. Let's get to at least 70%. Let's get 100 responses to this. The question is, which methodology do you follow? And if you can select methodology 1 or methodology 2, that would be great. Is 80 responses, 82, 83. Let's get a few more. Let's get to 90 and then we'll move forward. If you're here, if you're spending time learning, then you ought to be able to really participate. Why? Because that'll allow you to make the most of your time. And if you're thinking about reading the question and reading the argument as grouped in the same bucket overall. All right, we have 90 responses. That's wonderful. 57 or 58% of you follow the pre-thinking approach. The other 42% of you follow the other approach. Okay. The next thing is, where do you spend your time? If you follow the pre-thinking approach, where do you spend your time? Let me bring in that poll question. Do you spend time in reading and understanding the argument? Do you spend time in, sorry about that, rethinking the assumption or evaluating the answer choices? And this is only for those who follow the pre-thinking approach. So this is something which is very, this is something that you're going to really see. If you follow the pre-thinking approach, you're going to spend a lot more time with the argument than in selecting the answer choices. You would not have that back and forth with the answer choices if you follow the pre-thinking approach. And that's a place where I want you to get to. Okay, with that, let's start learning. And to do that, let's understand some basics of what an assumption is. And to do that, let's solve a question. Let's find an assumption for an argument that's very close to your heart. So I'm going to give you a generic argument, an argument which is a very simple argument, an argument in which you understand the context inside out. And your goal would be to tell me, what does the author assume in this argument? There's a short answer poll. You can put your responses over here. The argument says Joe scored 500 on the GMAT, therefore he will not get admission in an Ivy League college. And again, type your answers in. You would not see your answers show up till I've pressed broadcast results, which would be in about another 40 seconds or so. All right, 3, 2, and 1. I have 51 responses. And then most of them are really good. A lot of you have really said you need above 500 to get into an Ivy League college. Uh, uh, um, some of you have actually stated have gone above and beyond the argument to state something which may seem like a good thing, but it's not. But most of you have gotten the gist of the argument really well. And guys, when I ask you a question, please don't put your responses in the Q&A pod, because the Q&A pod is for your questions and not for your responses. So the argument says Joe scored 500 on the GMAT, therefore he will not get admission in an Ivy League college. So what's going on over here is, in the first statement, the author gives you a data point, and then in the second statement, based on that data point, the author makes a claim that Joe will not get admission into an Ivy League college. So if you think about it at a very high level, he jumps from that score of 500 to talking about Ivy League college over here. And while making that jump, the author assumes that a score of 500 for someone like Joe is unacceptable to Ivy League colleges. Okay, so 2 points over here. First of all, most of you were able to get to that point that a score of 500 is a requirement by Ivy League colleges. And so, if you understand the context of the argument really well, pre-thinking becomes a very natural exercise. So one prerequisite to being able to pre-think properly is to understand the context and understand the argument inside out. And this is an argument that each one of you, I think, thinks about, because all of you are studying for the GMAT. All of you are here attending this webinar on your Saturday morning or evening, depending on the time zone that you guys are in. The second thing which is there is the assumption is very linked. It's linked to the conclusion. And I say that because of this statement for someone like Joe. Why? Because the conclusion says, therefore, Joe will not get admission into an Ivy League college. The author is not saying that the Prince of Saudi Arabia will not get admission into Ivy League college. So hence, the assumption needs to have this piece, someone like Joe. Okay. So 2 points over here. Once that if you understand the context, pre-thinking becomes a very natural exercise. If you understand the conclusion, pre-thinking becomes a very natural exercise. The second thing is the assumption is very closely tied to the conclusion. With that, let's understand what an assumption is. I'm going to clear these responses. I'm going to ask you to tell me what's the definition of an assumption. What is the definition of an assumption? Okay, I have 34 responses. Let's get to 50. Last time we had 50 responses. Let's get to 50 responses this time as well. All right, 46, 47. And while those of you have posted, take some time to read what others are writing. You really get to understand the variety of opinions that you're going to get, that you get in a classroom which has 150 odd students. Okay, 55. So let's move forward and let's kind of read some of them. Something that makes the conclusion correct, unstated in the argument, but is obvious. An assumption, many a times is not obvious, I can tell you. It's a prediction. An assumption need not be a prediction. A prediction is the same thing as a claim. An assumption can be a fact as well. And it can be a claim too, but it can be a fact. So it can fall in both buckets. A piece of information on which the argument is based. You can say that, but every piece of information on which the argument is based is not an assumption. It has to be true for the conclusion to hold true. Yes, that's kind of closer to perfect definition. There are a couple of what I would call as a perfect definitions. There are about 80% of those definitions which are, let's say, which I'm almost there, but missed one teeny tiny thing out. So what is an assumption? An assumption is an unstated idea that must be true for the conclusion to be valid. And a number of you have embarked upon this must be true thing. A number of you have talked about it, that's unstated idea, but very few of you've combined both of them. There are about, I think I counted about 8 or 9 responses in which you stated both those things. So an assumption is something that's not stated in the argument. It's not obvious from the argument. It cannot be inferred from the argument. So it's an unstated idea which must be true for the conclusion to be valid. And again, you see the word conclusion and you see the word validity or holds true. So let me make the arrow properly. Okay. Now, what it means is that an assumption must provide new information. It has two characteristics. One is it must provide new information. The second is that it must be true for the conclusion to hold true. Without this, the conclusion can break down. And as you read the responses, you're going to find that a few of them mention both of these facts. And good job on that, guys. When you think about a correct answer, you're going to find that a correct answer will satisfy both of these characteristics. It will provide new information that's not obvious from the argument, and it will satisfy that must be true condition. And we're going to focus the next couple of slides on this must be true condition. What is this must be true condition? Okay, so if you were to think about an argument like this house where this conclusion is this roof over here. Okay, that's your conclusion, and you see these three pillars that are supporting this conclusion. So these three pillars are what we call as premises, because why? These are supporting statements. Now, while each of these three pillars makes the conclusion stronger, only one of these pillars may be essential for that roof to stay upright, to prevent that roof from breaking down. And that one pillar, that one essential pillar, is your assumption. Okay, so the difference between a premise and an assumption supports a statement, a premise also supports us. An assumption supports the conclusion, a premise also supports the conclusion. But an assumption is that essential pillar without which the conclusion will be invalidated or has the chance to be destroyed. Okay, so essentially, what does this must be true mean? In very simple words, if the information provided by the assumption is not true, then the conclusion can no longer hold true, or the conclusion will be invalidated. And we're going to look at this with an example. Or in other words, we go to that definition that the assumption must be true for the conclusion to be valid. That's what must be true really means. So to do that, let's understand what does it mean by the conclusion being invalidated. So what is falsification or destroying the conclusion? And let's take the same argument, which is, that Joe scored 500 on the GMAT, therefore he'll not get admission into an Ivy League college. So what happens, or how can you destroy that conclusion? You can destroy that conclusion if Joe gets admission into an Ivy League college with a score of 500. If the possibility exists that Joe gets admission into an Ivy League college with that score of 500, then that conclusion is destroyed. And why do we say this? That if the possibility exists, then this conclusion is destroyed. Why? Because the author is very emphatic in stating that Joe will not get admission into an Ivy League college. Can each one of you understand the falsification condition? Very simple, something that's really close to your heart. And it's once you understand this principle, it's the same principle that you apply to the most complex of arguments. So then let's see, how do we evaluate whether an answer choice is correct? Now, in this case, we already know the correct answer choice. And so it'll be easier for you to evaluate, understand that evaluation. So what is that correct answer choice? Same argument over here. You have that argument for reference. The answer choice that we said is correct is that a score of 500 on the GMAT for someone like Joe is unacceptable to Ivy League college. So then let's evaluate, does this satisfy that must be true condition? And what does satisfying that must be true condition mean? It means, will Joe actually get admission, or which is the conclusion breakdown condition, if this statement no longer holds true. So if this assumption, this statement that, sorry about that, bad annotation. Let's change my annotation. If this statement no longer holds true, the statement to the left, then will the conclusion breaks down. So if this particular statement no longer holds true, then what holds true, and that's by definition of a statement not holding true, is that the negated version of that statement automatically becomes true. So if this statement is not true, then the negated version, which is this version, automatically becomes true. Okay, what becomes true? A score of 500 for someone like Joe is acceptable to Ivy League colleges. Okay, or Ivy League schools as stated over here. So what happens when this statement becomes true? What happens to our conclusion? Does the conclusion break down when a score of 500 becomes acceptable? Absolutely. Why? Because if a score of 500 becomes acceptable, then the author cannot say with 100% certainty that Joe will not get admission into an Ivy League college. Why? Because suddenly the score of 500 has become acceptable. And when you do this, what you're doing is essentially applying the negation test. Okay. And again, we're still not on pre-thinking. We're still trying to understand our assumption. So some of you may be wondering, how can we really say that if a statement is not true, then its negated version automatically becomes true? How many of you are wondering that if a statement is not true, then how can its negated version automatically become true? All right, about 76, 77% of you are wondering. Let's kind of take some examples to really see that. And we're going to take very, very simple examples. And someone was really saying, what is the prerequisite towards learning arguments? The prerequisite for learning arguments is to learn this aspect, which is how do you read a statement? What do you infer from the statement? If you say, so the principle that you have to understand, and what happened to my I in if over here, because it's there in my presentation. If you say that a statement is not true, then by definition, its negated version becomes true. That's a principle that you should remember. And let's kind of take some examples over here. If you look at this statement which says Harvard has the best MBA program, and if you say that statement is not true, by definition, what you're also saying is that A, Harvard does not have the best MBA program, or an MBA program which is better than Harvard or as good as Harvard exists. Does that make sense? Right? If you say this statement is not true, which is Harvard has the best MBA program, then you're automatically saying that this statement is true. So that's kind of the principle, that when you say a statement isn't true, its negated version automatically becomes true. Similarly, when you say Joe runs faster than David, if that statement is not true, then what you're also saying is that David runs just as fast as John, or David could run even faster than John. That's an automatic implication. And that's really, really important to understand. And we're not doing this just in the context of critical reasoning, just in general with statements. If you say some statement isn't true, by definition, its negated version becomes true. And again, in real life also that happens. If you say I'm taking the GMAT, then you're not taking the GMAT. Okay, so it's really, really important to keep this in mind, that if an answer choice must be true, which means it's the correct assumption, then in the presence of the negated version of that particular answer choice, the conclusion will break down. Why? Because it must be true, which means that without that answer choice, the conclusion cannot hold true. And it's built on that very definition of assumption that we just learned, which is it's an unstated idea that must be true for the conclusion to remain valid. Let's look at the other side of it. If an answer choice is not must be true, which means that it's the incorrect answer choice, and I don't know why this software is eating my eyes. So because it should be if over here. It should be I over here. If the answer choice is the incorrect answer choice, then the conclusion will not break down in the presence of negated version of that answer choice. Which means if you look at and try and evaluate an incorrect answer choice, what you're going to find is that in the presence of that negated version, the conclusion still holds true. Let's kind of evaluate an answer choice. Same argument. One of you really said in the short answer pod when I talked about what an assumption is, that one of the assumptions is that a score of 500 is not a good score. Let's see whether that's the correct answer choice or not. And to do that, we ask this question: is this must be true, exactly like we did last time? Or in other words, we said, will the conclusion become invalid? Will Joe get admission into Ivy League college if the statement to the left no longer holds true? So let's see what happens when the statement to the left no longer holds true. If a score of 500 is not a good score, then its negated instances that a score of 500 is a good score. Now, if suddenly a score of 500 is deemed a good score, then will Joe get admission into Ivy League college? The answer is no, not really. Why? Because as per the argument, that Joe's admission is not predicated or dependent on how the score of 500 is qualified, whether you call it a good score or a bad score. In other words, if we replace this argument, this 500 with 700 and 700, the argument will still hold true. Okay, so what's the purpose of understanding this must be true? It helps you narrow down. For the correct answer choice, your conclusion will break down, it will be destroyed in the presence of the negated version. For the incorrect answer choice, the conclusion will continue to hold true in the presence of that negated version of this answer choice. And that's really, really important for you to understand. Why? Because when you're confused, this is your weapon. So this was what we covered till now in the first 20 odd minutes of this webinar is the basics of assumption. If you did not know assumption, you now know a bit of it. If you knew assumption, those concepts have been cemented. So now let's talk about how to pre-think. Okay, so and let's talk about how to pre-think for a bit more complex arguments that we call it 650 level, 700 level on the GMAT. Why? Because most of you want to get to that score of 700 or higher. So what's the process that we're going to follow? I'm going to give you an argument, just an argument. You're going to put in your pre-thinking. We'll record your answers in a short answer poll. Then I'm going to pre-think my way, and I'm going to talk about that unified process to do pre-thinking. Then we're going to look at and evaluate a couple of submissions. Now, what is it that you need to do to pre-think? There are a few things that you need to do. First is you need to identify the facts and claims. You need to be able to read the argument properly, understand the conclusion. I recommend at this stage that you read the conclusion twice and focus on every word in the conclusion. Before you even think about, hey, what the assumption would be, understand the logic that the author uses to arrive at the conclusion, and make sure you have a precise understanding of what the assumption is. Those of you who falter, the reason why you would falter is because you try and read this argument really quickly. And you'd worry too much. You'd keep looking at the clock. Now, I will give you 3.5 minutes just to come up with an assumption. There are no answer choices to evaluate. It's just a relatively simple argument. Okay, it's a 3-statement argument. Okay, here's your first argument. Now, let me just ask this question. Is the audio still loud and clear? I heard a couple of you complaining, but I want to make sure that for majority of you, the audio is good. Okay, upwards of 90% of you can hear me clearly. If you're facing issues with audio, I'm sorry guys, I just join again. If you are on a slightly slower internet connection, if your internet connection if you're joining using a cellular connection, you're going to find that audio would vary, and it's not because the system's going wrong. It's because your connection is not reliable all the time. Again, so if you join again, you reset your connection and the problem will sort out by itself. Perfect. All right, guys. So here is your first argument. I'm going to mute myself for about 3.5 to 4 minutes. Here's a short answer pod in which you're going to record your assumptions or assumption, one or more. Um, Before I show the question, make sure you get your pen and paper ready. Make sure that you have a bottle of water ready with you because the session's going to get much more intense from this point on. We're going to think in a couple of dimensions as we move forward. So get a pen and paper. Make sure you have a bottle of water with you. 3, 2, and 1. And here is the argument. Again, you have to find the assumption. What does the author assume over here? Right, guys, I have 21 assumptions, some of them pretty decent. I'm going to give you another 30 seconds to put your responses in. All right, 3, 2, and 1. I'm going to broadcast results. I have 57 answers. That's excellent. I want to thank you guys for participating. That is wonderful. Uh, so I have some very interesting assumptions. A couple of you, when you posted your assumptions, were quite spot on. I have a few assumptions that go around uh, uh, the overall issue and not tackle the real issue that the author is talking about. So to do that, let's kind of approach this question in a systematic fashion. I'm going to give you about 30 to 40 seconds to read what others have written, and then I'm going to remove those polls so that we can get on it with and learning the approach to pre-think assumptions. Three, two, and one. Let's just move this away. All right. So how do we approach pre-thinking? Okay, we first make sure we understand the argument, and to understand the argument, we isolate the conclusion, we understand the conclusion. Then we look at the logical structure, which is how we understand how does the author arrive at the conclusion, and then we pre-think. We ask some pre-thinking questions, and in response to all of these, the pre-thinking question that we ask with this context in mind allows us to understand what the assumptions are. And what is this pre-thinking question? So if you think about this pre-thinking question, it starts from that very definition of assumption. What is an assumption? It's an unstated idea that must be true for the conclusion to be valid. Now, in other words, if you remember the example that we gave, we said the conclusion is like a roof, and assumption is that essential pillar that keeps that conclusion upright, which means that without the assumption, the conclusion will break down. So if that's the case, and if an assumption is that essential pillar, then an assumption is built around those scenarios in which the conclusion does indeed break down. Why? Because that's where you would put an assumption over there. So to find assumptions, we need to figure out scenarios that break the conclusion down, that falsify the conclusion. So the way to find assumptions out is if you ask the question, under what circumstances, given the facts in the argument, will the conclusion break down? Why? Because an assumption has to protect against those circumstances by definition. So here's the same argument, and I've divided this argument into 3 statements. What I want you to tell me is which statement out of these 3 is the main conclusion. And I'm going to give you a poll question. That poll question has 4 statements because I reuse this poll question for another question. Please focus on selecting one of the first 3 statements only, because this argument has just 3 statements. The question is, which statement is the main conclusion? Let's get a few more responses. I have just about 41 responses. I want to get at least 70 responses. I got 58 responses to the short answer poll question here. 63, 65, 64, not 65, 66. The question is, which statement is the main conclusion? 71. That is wonderful. And again, it's really important that you participate, because once you participate, you take a stand. And if you're correct, you get positive reinforcement. If you're incorrect, you really know where you're faltering, and that's very valuable. Ask someone who's at a 650 or a 700 to really say, can you pinpoint why I make a mistake? And that insight is invaluable for that person. So 60% of you think that that statement 2 is the main conclusion, and that indeed is the main conclusion. 20% of you think statement 3 is the main conclusion, and another 19%, around about 20%, think statement 1 is the main conclusion. So the correct answer is statement 2. Why? Because this is what the author is trying to really say. When you read the statement, clearly the difference between professors in the tenure system and other full-time lecturers has to do with the reward system for the former. This is what the author wants you to believe. Now, people who think that statement 1 is the main conclusion, the reason why people believe statement and incorrectly believe that statement 1 is the main conclusion is because they see this word concludes over here and they say, hey man, the word concludes exists, so this must be the conclusion. Remember, in an argument, the main conclusion is always by the author. And what is the conclusion? The definition of a conclusion is, in this argument, what does the author want you to believe? If you look at the entire argument, you'll realize that this is what the author wants you to believe. Okay. This statement over here is merely a fact or a data point, which sets the context for this entire argument. And then what is statement number 3? Statement number 3 is written to make statement number 2 more believable. So statement number 3 is written to support statement number 2. Okay, let me just erase this so that it doesn't bother us with the text. Statement 3 is a supporting statement, and statement 1 is the context. Okay, it sets the stage of for the argument. Okay, so what's a pre-thinking question? Remember, the pre-thinking question is, under what circumstances, given the facts in the argument, does the conclusion break down? And we're going to model that pre-thinking question for this particular argument, and we're going to ask, under what circumstances would the reward system not be responsible for the difference in performance? Remember, the conclusion was that the reward system causes the difference in performance. So the breakdown condition is that this reward system is not responsible for the difference in performance. Okay. Given that full-time lecturers enhance student learning more than professors do as per this paper, and given that reward system for professors places a greater emphasis on research than on teaching. I want you to take some time and read this and really say, hey, if I get an answer to this question, will that answer break my conclusion down? Take some time. And select yes. If you agree, the answer to this question will break your conclusion down. That under what circumstances would the reward system not be responsible for the difference in performance? Another thing that you need to notice that we are not contesting the difference in performance. We agree that is happening. Why? Because it's given as a fact to us. What we are really contesting is what is the cause of that difference in performance. Okay. Now, some of you stated in your pre-thinking that reward system is the only cause for the difference in performance. Yes, in a principal way, that's correct. But in an answer choice, that's not how you would see the answer choice being worded. Okay. So with that, let's kind of look at this. We're going to look at this once again. Under what conditions will the reward system not cause the difference between tenured and non-tenured, given that reward system for tenured places greater emphasis on research than on teaching? Now, so under what conditions would the reward system, under what conditions can you not blame the reward system for this difference in performance? Here are some possible scenarios. One is if non-tenured has the same reward system. In that case, you can't blame the reward system for the difference in performance. Something else has to be responsible for the difference in performance. Is this clear? If non-tenured has the same reward system, then you can't blame the reward system, right? Something else has to be blamed. Okay, if you're saying no, then please pose in your question in the Q&A pod and I'll be happy to discuss your doubt. But 90% of you get that. What if you have this reward system for tenured faculty, but this most tenured faculty do not act as per the reward system. So, if 90% of the tenured professors don't care about the reward system, and a case in point being, Deepanshul, you've got to be a bit more specific with regards to when you say, I did not get this part, what is that part that you did not get? So if you can have a reward system, but if most tenured professors don't care about the reward system, then you can't blame the reward system. Okay, and case in point being that all of us have goals, but while working in the corporate world, there are many of us who do not look at goals. And so what are your assumptions? That one is that non-tenured professors do not have an identical reward system, and most tenured professors actually care about the reward system. Now, and one thing that I want to make sure is, some of you were able to get to these assumptions, but many of you were not. But can you now see that if you ask the pre-thinking question methodically, you can come up with these falsification scenarios and which allow you to come up with assumptions? Can you see that? If you ask this pre-thinking question, the response to that allows you to figure out conditions where assumptions need to be built. Okay, Gerardo has a great question. Gerardo says, why do we need to care about the reward system? After all, the argument, and I'm going to really just come to the argument is about the effectiveness of professors. So let me ask another question. Is this argument about effectiveness of professors? No. What is this argument about? And Gerardo, that's where understanding the conclusion is. What is the author concluding in this? About what is causing that, or the implication of reward system. It's not about student learning, it's about what is causing that student learning. Okay, Gerard, do you understand this? And I'm going to show the conclusion to you again. If you look at the conclusion, no one's disputing that lecturers are more effective in teaching students. What we are trying to figure out is what is causing this difference in learning. Okay, what's the cause of it? Okay, and that's why we focus on the reward system more than anything else, because according to the author, what the author is saying is it's the reward system that causes the difference in learning. And that's something that you have to understand. It's not about students learning, it's about the reward system. Okay, so I'm going to so for those of you who have no idea what negation means, who have no idea how to negate statements, we've written probably the most comprehensive article that exists on negation. In fact, that's the most comprehensive piece of literature you're going to find in negation series. So it's a fairly technical article. If you want to know more about negation, it'll help you build your inference skills. It'll help you with arguments. Here's the link over there. Okay. So now we're going to solve a question in which what you're going to find is that if you ask that's an official question that we're going to solve. I'm going to give you 3.5 minutes to answer this question. What you're going to find is that there are a couple of close answer choices in this argument, but if you ask the pre-thinking question, you're going to come up with just one answer, which is the correct answer. Let me just put in my poll here for the next question. And before I put my poll, I want you to select this choice which says not answered. Why do I want to do that? Because that way, I get to know whether how many of you have chosen an answer. So select this answer choice not answered. As you choose another answer choice, I'll know that you've chosen an answer and you're done with the question. And I'll call time only when 80% of the class is done with the question. So I have 120 students. I want to make sure that I get at least 70 to 75 folks selecting not answered. Okay, I have 55 not answered. Can I get one more thing? A few more not answered, please. 59 not answered. 60 people have chosen one answer choice or the other. 62, 63, 64. Guys, I'm waiting for you to select not answered or one of the other answer choices. That way, you as a group decide your timing. Okay. Actually, I forgot that there was another section. So I know a lot of people, a lot of you have been asking about timing, and what you're really saying is, hey man, this seems to be a lot of analysis. The solutions that I read elsewhere, they don't seem to have this kind of analysis, and is it going to take a lot longer for me to answer the question? And I'm already worried about timing. So here's how you're going to feel as you go through this journey of pre-thinking. Let's say you're this particular person who's starting at point number one over here, where your accuracy in critical reasoning is low and your time to answer questions is medium. When you start pre-thinking, two things will happen. Your accuracy will go out, you'll solve more questions correctly, and your time to answer questions will also go up. Why? Because you're now adding one step and you're still not done with that step. You're still not mastered that step. And you're going to ask at that point in time, hey, why the hell am I doing pre-thinking? I already worry about timing on the GMAT, and this is something that's increasing my time to answer questions. And the funny thing is, most people are not happy about the fact that they can answer more questions correctly, but they're just worried about this, that I'm able to I'm taking more time on while answering questions. But as you continue with that journey of pre-thinking, you're gonna a time will come when pre-thinking will start to become more and more natural for you. And at that point in time, um, what you're gonna realize is that, hey, your accuracy continues to go up, your time to answer question goes down, and it's gone down even beyond the point when you started. And at that point, you're gonna really say, now I understand why pre-thinking works. And you'd really be able to embrace pre-thinking fully. And as you continue to do pre-thinking, you're going to find that uh, uh, your accuracy goes up, your time to answer questions, that time goes down as well. Now, we have many students who are paid students at e-GMAT. And even though we're just starting the assumption piece over here, I want to ask you, which level are you in, given the little time that you guys have spent on critical reasoning? We call this level 1, 2, 3, or 4. So this is 1, this is 2, this is 3, and this is 4. At 1, you've not even started pre-thinking. At 2, you've started pre-thinking, but are taking longer, but you've seen that accuracy improve. At 3, you've continued to see that accuracy improve, but you've also seen that time go down. And at 4, you know, you're jumping up and down, and CR has become your strength, and you are able to do better in other sections because you get more time. So this is wonderful. What you really see is that that you have a few people in level 1, but Majority of the group is in level 2, and this is really good because you're trying. We have a significant number of you in level 3, which is really, really good. Just at the very beginning, assumptions is right after inference. You still have evaluate, strength, and weaken to go through. You still have most of assumption to go through. So that's really, really good. Um, so I'm really, really hopeful that in about 3 to 4 days, a good chunk of those in level 2 will come to level 3. Okay. With that, let's kind of look at the argument, or let's look at the question. Um, Man, I want to go to the questions. And so essentially, some people who've done pre-thinking before has an example of a student who really said, hey, this pre-thinking primes the mind and we're constantly on our toes while reading an RC passage or a CR question stem. Apart from comprehending the passage, we keep speculating in which direction the passage, in this case the argument, will go, or what logical jump has the author taken. And there's a guy who scored 740. He improved from 520 in his mock test to 740 on the actual GMAT. Okay, with that, let's look at example 2. It's an official argument. It's an official example. It's called Highway Commission. And again, here's your poll. Select the correct answer. I'm going to All right, guys, 80% of the class is done. So it'd be really nice if those of you who've not put in your responses, if you guys could put in your responses. Three, two, and one. Let's end the poll. I'm going to broadcast the results, but before that, I want you to tell me how many of you, regardless of which answer choice you chose, were confused between one or the other. How many of you were confused between two answer choices? Okay, let's get a few more responses. It's really important when you have these many people in a particular webinar, and and you look at it and say, man, others are getting confused as I am as well. So you kind of really realize it's natural. A lot of people will get confused, but again, remember, those who can think past that confusion are the ones who get to those 730, 740 scores. And knowing both of those things is important. So if you're getting confused, it's a natural process. A lot of people do get confused. Uh, but again, if you think about it, if you understand why you got confused and not get confused for the same reason again, then you're gonna improve. Okay, that is perfect. 60% of you got confused. Let me broadcast the results, and what you find is two answer choices, very popular choice E, the most popular answer choice, but 40% of you chose that. Choice B, also very popular. So let's see what's going on over here. It's fairly simple argument. It's an official question. It's not an e-GMAT question. So what's going on is, you know, we need to finance roads, and the Highway Commission of a certain state is considering a 50% increase in the 10 cents per mile toll for vehicles using the toll highway. So the current toll price is 10 cents per mile, and they're considering a 50% increase. The Highway Commissioner claims that the toll increase will increase the annual revenue generated by the toll highway by at least 50%. Okay. I have a question which says, do we know what is the level of this question? Looking at the wisdom of this group, the accuracy is 40%, so the level of this question is 700 level. And which is kind of consistent. I mean, we've had about 10,000 people respond to this question. The accuracy is usually below 50%, and which is what makes a question 700 level. Okay, so let's kind of understand this argument, and what are we looking to increase? We're looking to increase the annual revenue. So how do you estimate the annual revenue? Very simple idea. And the annual revenue is toll per mile multiplied by the total number of miles. Everyone understands this? Hold on, let me just put in a yes no poll here. So everyone understands this? That's the annual revenue, toll per mile multiplied by the total number of miles traveled. Fairly simple. Okay. Now, under what circumstance, what are we given in this? What are we given here? We are already given that the toll per mile is going to go up by 50%. Let's just put in my pen. We're already given that this value is going to go up by 50%. So let's ask a pre-thinking question. Under what circumstances, given the facts in the argument, will the conclusion break down? Which translates to, under what circumstances would the annual revenue not increase by 50%, provided, and that's why it's important to put that context in, provided that the toll per mile will increase by 50%. So if you know that the toll per mile is going to increase by 50%, what's the only condition under which the annual revenue will not go up by 50%? If the total number of miles decreases. Yes, that's the only condition. The total number of miles decreases. So that's your falsifying scenario. Then what is your assumption? The total number of miles driven does not decrease. Very simple, right? If the assumption is the total number of miles does not decrease, and it's not decreased by 50%, it does not decrease, period. Sorry, that's I changed my annotation. It does not decrease, period. That's what it is. So far, you guys are with me? Things are simple? Yes, no? All right. Why? Because if the total number of miles decreases, then you can't really say that the annual revenue is going to go up by 50%. It's very similar to that GMAT question that the first example that we did. All right. So let's look at the answer choices. Remember, the assumption, the pre-thinking assumption is total number of miles does not decrease. Okay. So let's look at the answer choices. Which answer choice talks about the total number of miles over here? I'm going to put in the short answer pod. Which answer choice talks about this about the total number of miles? Choice E. Okay, I understand some of you have talked about choice B and are confused about choice B. We're going to discuss choice B, but which answer choice specifically talks about the total number of miles is this one. Why? Because we talk about total distance traveled. Okay, and which is what makes choice E the correct answer. Now let's see why choice B is not the correct answer. B for beta. Okay, choice B says the total number of trips traveled on the toll highway will not decrease from its current level. Now, I want you, before we evaluate this, what is the definition of an assumption? Can you write that down? What's the definition of an assumption? Simple. How do we define assumption? It's an unstated idea that must be true for the conclusion to hold true. Okay. Unstated idea that must be true. So what we have to evaluate is that this must be true. So again, we're going to do the same evaluation that we said, the must be true question. So this answer choice, and I'm going to move this out over here. Let's look at this answer choice. It says the total number of trips made on the toll highway per year will not decrease from its current level. What it's really saying is that, hey, if today 1,000 trips are made with 10 cents per mile as toll, tomorrow that number is not going to go down to 900. Okay. So the question that we have to ask is, does this mean that the total number of miles traveled on the roads will go down? Does it necessarily mean that the total number of miles traveled will go down? Select yes or no. If the number of trips went down from 1,000 to 900, forgive my writing, guys, consider it to be 900, does necessarily mean that the total number of miles traveled would go down? The simple answer is no, not really. Okay, not really. Why? Because the total number of miles traveled may still remain the same despite fewer trips if the number of miles per trip increases. Okay, so which is why choice B is not a must be true. It's not an MBT or must be true. Is that clear to everyone? Remember, by definition, an assumption is something that must be true for the conclusion to hold true, which means if the assumption is not true, the conclusion will break down. In this case, if you consider this to be an assumption, if you said, hey, this is not true, which means, hey, instead of 1,000, we can get to 900 trips, does the total number of miles go down? No, not really. Why? Because if each trip picks up the slack, it doesn't go down. And in that case, the conclusion doesn't break down. Okay. So if you have any doubt, you can put that in the Q&A pod. And again, the reason why every other answer choice is incorrect is because of this. It's every other answer choice is not a must be true. Now, if this were a strengthened question, choice B is an excellent strengthener. Again, which is what makes this confusing. Choice B is not an assumption, it's not a must be true, but it's a strengthener. All right. The average length of the trip. All right. Let's look at choice C. What is choice C? The reasoning is going to be the same. It's how we morph that reasoning is going to be different. Choice C talks about the average length of the trip will not decrease. So let's say earlier on the average length, and again that's where you have, let's say the average length earlier was 50 miles. Sorry. Hold on. Hold on. Let me just put in a note spot. I don't like annotating over here. Notes, where are my notes here? Here is my notes pod. So if earlier, which is before the toll increase, let me just increase the font so that you guys don't pull your eyes out. Okay, now the average length actually now decreases. Now with the increased toll becomes 40 miles. My question to ask is, does it mean that the total number of miles travels, that number has decreased? Tell me yes versus no. Does it mean if the average length has gone down, does it mean the total number of miles has decreased? Necessarily decreased. For with 100% certainty, can you say that? The answer is no. Why? What if, okay, remember the total number of miles traveled is equal to number of trips multiplied by length per trip. If the number of trips goes down, then length per trip can pick up the slack. If the length per trip goes down, then the number of trips can pick up the slack. So either one of these factors by itself cannot constitute an assumption. Why? Because the other one can pick up the slack. Renzo and Amiradi, does that help? Okay, perfect. And again, that's where, as I said, you've got to understand the fundamentals. And that's when you understand the fundamentals, that would be there. Nikhil says, wouldn't E still be the best strengthener too? So Nikhil, E is still the strengthener, yes. But remember this, there's no concept of a best strengthener. And I will tell you this, on good created questions, there is only one strengthener. You'd be hard pressed to provide one official question that has two strengtheners and you say, this one is better than the other. If an expert tells you this choice is better than the other and hence that's why you choose this, then please don't take any more advice from that expert. There's no best strengthener. There is a strengthener or there isn't a strengthener. Okay, and yes, E is still a strengthener. Okay, that's why this is not a strengthen question, it's an assumption question. What about choice A? Do we care about Nilotopal? Do we care about the amount of money required for repairs in the conclusion? We don't. The conclusion is not about the amount of money required. The conclusion is about the revenue. Okay. So again, that's some of the reasons why when you pre-think, you understand those falsification questions. And when you understand those falsification questions, you are able to precisely pinpoint what an assumption would be. All right, with that, let's come to the last part of this webinar where we're going to solve a few more questions. Again, our process is going to be the same. I'm going to ask you to choose in this particular answer choice which says not answered. and as 80% of you choose another answer choice other than not answered, I'm going to call time. All right, let's get 50 people to choose not answered. And we're going to solve two questions, one after the other now. So we're going to increase the intensity a bit more. Okay, 49. We need one more person to choose one of the answer choices. Okay, now I'm going to see the question. I'm going to remove broadcast results. I'm going to see the question. I'm going to show the question. I'm sorry, not see the question. I'm going to show the question now. So this is a difficult question. Read it slowly. Make notes as you do this. And I'm going to shut up. Okay, guys, most of the class is done. Can you put in your responses, please? I'm gonna give you another 30 seconds to get to your answers. And then we'll do the next poll. Five, four, three, two, and one. Let me end the poll. I'm going to broadcast the results, and you really see is how people have chosen. There's the three choices, actually four choices with upwards of 10% of responses. Here's the next poll. You guys know the drill. You have to select not answered. So I'd like to get at least 50 responses for not answered, and then I'm going to show the next question. And then we'll discuss both these questions one after the other. All right, I have 50 responses. Let me deselect share results, and here is your next question. It's a relatively easier question. All right, guys. Almost 80% of the class is done, so I'm going to give you another 20 seconds to put your responses in. Five, four, three, two, and one. Let me end the poll. I'm going to broadcast the results. Choice D again. Choice D is quite popular, and that's a clear winner over here. The only other two choices that are popular are choice. Actually, we still have three other choices that are more than 10% of the responses, but we see a much more clear winner over here. So let's review these questions. Now, just to set some context, both of these are difficult questions. Both of these are 700 level questions. This particular question, and both of these questions have very simple logic. Okay, and the reason why I have these questions in this towards the end is because it's to just to illustrate you when you consider a question to be difficult. It's not because the question has complex logic. It's because the question has either more information or a language that you don't usually see. So this particular question has a lot of terminology, and even though I gave you a ton of time, you guys faltered on this. Many of you faltered on this because you couldn't understand and comprehend the terminology completely. So let's look at this over here. I'm going to show the results once again. Uh, Choice A was clearly the most popular choice with about 40% of you choosing. Choice D was really popular. Choices B and C were very popular as well. The only choice that wasn't popular, and I'm happy that it's not popular, is choice E. Okay. So what's happening over here? Um, you have this town called Verland, and and this is an argument that goes back in time. It's in the 90s. And what the author is really saying is the number of Verlanders receiving special program information did not increase a whole lot between the years of 94 and 96. So this is your main conclusion, and I think it's fairly easy to identify that this is the main conclusion. There are two things that I want to make sure that you observe about this main conclusion. In this conclusion, the first thing is in this conclusion, the author is only interested in this time period 94 to 96. The author is not interested in what happened before 94 or what happened after 96. The second thing is the author is only interested about special program information and the number of Verlanders. He's not interested about people who are not Verlanders. He's not interested about people who not interested about programs that don't fall into the category of special programs. Did you guys observe this while reading the argument? Again, this is just observation. We're not even drawing inferences right now. Okay. Then the author provides his reasoning for this conclusion. He says there are two things that happened between 94 and 96. Okay. One is that the number of RDS equipped radios was remain more or less unchanged. So the receiving radios, the radios that people have to listen to programs, if that number in 94 was 100, in 96 that remained about 100 as well. And the number of transmitting stations increased quite a bit. It went from 250 to 600. Okay, these are stations that transmit the special programming. Now, if you look at this term, however, what you're going to find is this term connects statement number 2 and statement number 3, which means that if statement number 3 is supporting your main conclusion, then statement number 2 kind of goes against that main conclusion. So this statement, or rather this statement, goes against that main conclusion. Why? Because if you have more transmitting stations, you would expect this number over here, the number of landers, to go up. So far with me? We're just reading the argument right now. Okay. Now, the first statement sets the context. It is really important to understand this context. Okay. What does the first statement say? Radio stations with RDS technology, okay, broadcast special programs, so special program information that only radios with an RDS feature can receive. So what you infer from this, and you have to infer something from this, is that, hey, if you want to get special programs, you need the radio stations with RDS technology, and you need the radios with RDS feature. You need both those things. Read this statement once again and tell me if this is clear to you. Okay. So let's create what we call as a logical structure of the argument. Between 94 and 96, very few additional Verlanders receives RDS programs. And why is the presentation eating the text? What happened between 94 and 96? Okay, there are two things that happened. One is the number of RDS radios that remained almost unchanged. The second is the number of RDS stations, the transmitting stations increased a lot. And what context do we have? Excuse me. To receive RDS programming, you need these special radios and you need the transmitting stations as well. Okay, based on this, the author arrives at this conclusion. So, what's the falsification question? Under what conditions will there be a significant addition to the number of people receiving RDS programming, given that we have very few additional radios and given that we have a lot more transmitting stations? So can you tell me, how can we falsify this conclusion? And again, this has to be additional. How can we falsify this conclusion? Under what conditions will there be more people who can receive special programming? Okay, if the range increases, I think the word is not range, the word is coverage. Okay. Or if the number of people listening for radio increase. Who said that? Abhishek. Yes, that's really, really good. And Piyush. Perfect. So there are two ways in which we can falsify this. One is if you have these new stations, they transmit to people who had the right kind of radios but were not covered earlier, or if we put these radios in Starbucks, which means on an average the people per radio increases. Both of these conditions will falsify or will break this particular conclusion down. So what are your assumptions? Assumptions are the new stations, they don't increase coverage a whole lot, and people per radio remain the same. Everyone's with me so far? All right, that's perfect. So let's now evaluate the answer choices, and we're going to take a look at each answer choice one by one. Choice A, which is our correct answer, is our correct answer. Let's see what it says. Choice is worded in a very complex manner. It says few, if any, of RDS radio stations that began broadcasting after 94 broadcast to people with RDS equipped radios living in areas not previously. Man, this is super complex. Let's kind of simplify it. So few, if any, a simplification of it is almost none. Of the RDS stations that began broadcasting after 94, which are the RDS stations that began broadcasting after 94? These are the new radio stations. Okay. Broadcast to people who had the right kind of radios, with RDS equipped radios, living in areas not previously reached. So if you're broadcasting to people with the right radios, living in areas that were not previously reached, then what are you doing? You're increasing the coverage. And sorry about that. I don't know why this is eating my eyes over here. You're increasing the coverage of RDS programming as well as the periods. Okay. So can everyone see how the simplification leads to this? Take some time. Look at it. Let's apply our falsification condition or the negation test. What's the negated statement? at least some radio stations increase coverage. What happens to the conclusion if at least some radio stations increase coverage? If some radio stations increase, the new radio stations increase coverage, then my conclusion breaks down, which is why this is the correct answer. Why? Because in the presence of the negated version of this answer choice, my conclusion breaks down. Okay, so which is why this is my correct answer. Now we're going to evaluate every other answer choice as well. Let's look at choice B. Choice B was really popular, as was choice D. And then I want to make sure you understand why you made a mistake. Choice B talks about, let's kind of look at this. What was the conclusion about? The conclusion was about what happened in the period 94 to 96. And the conclusion was about special programs. Choice B says in the year 1996. Okay, so it's not about that period, it's about what was there in 1996. Most were landers, which means a majority of, so yeah, let's say 70% of our landers who lived within the listening area already had a radio equipped to receive RDS. So to reject this choice, you would have said, hey, the conclusion is about 94 to 96. This is purely talking about 96. So this is not likely the correct answer, even before you analyze this. But let's analyze this and say, what is this choice saying? This choice is saying that if you lived within an RDS equipped area, you actually had an RDS radio, or let's say if 70% of the people lived within an RDS equipped area, you had an RDS radio. Now, the question to ask over here is it required that majority of the people have an RDS radio in 1996? What if in 94, hold on, in 1994, 20%, and forgive my handwriting, of the people had the radio, and in 96, also that number is 20%. Will the conclusion still not hold true? Is it required that that number be majority? Remember, the conclusion is only about the fact that the number of people who received the special program in 94 and 96 did not change. The conclusion is not about whether 50% of the people were receiving that special program in 94 and 50% of the people, or 60% of the people were receiving that special program in 94 and 60% were receiving in 96. Guys, short answer pod. Is that required? Is this majority required? Yes or no? No, it isn't required. Okay. Why? Because the conclusion is about the change in number of listeners between 94 and 96. It's not about how many listeners were there in 94 and how many listeners were there in 96. Choice C talks about what happens to a radio when you equip it with RDS technology. Do we care about it? No. Why? Because let me ask you this question. What is the range of a radio of special programming from a radio station that does not have RDS technology? If a radio station does not have RDS technology, can it broadcast special program information as per my argument? No. So the range is 0. So what happens when you equip a radio station with RDS technology is not my concern. Why? Because without equipping the radio station with RDS technology, it can't even transmit my special programs, which is what my conclusion is about. So this impact is on other programming, not on special programming. And we don't care about other programming in the conclusion. Choice D, which was really popular, okay, again talks about in 1996, were landers who did not own radios, so who did not have the right kind of radios, could not receive any programming from RDS radio stations. Two questions over here. Do we care about people who don't have the right kind of radio? Do we care about them? And do we care about any programming?
No. Because of these two reasons, choice D is very wrong. It talks about all the wrong things. Okay. And Nikhil has a good question. I'm going to come back to it. Type of programming again doesn't matter. So what Nikhil says is, if the number of people listening per radio does not increase, then how does it increase the number of listeners? Okay, great question, Nikhil. And let me actually use the real estate on this slide to to do that. Let me just clean. So, good question. And I used to have a diagram for this, so I'm going to try and do that. So I'm going to try and recreate a diagram, Nikhil, so bear with me. So let's say in the year 1994, let's kind of create these dots as receiving radios. These are radios that people have, okay? And these are RDS radios, so which means they can receive special programming, okay? Now, let's create transmitting stations over here. I'm going to create a transmitting station with a star. Why? Because the star has these spokes, so it looks cool. So these are your transmitting stations in 94. Now, assuming that each transmitting station can only go one dot in either direction, are there people who have the right kind of radio but are not able to receive special programming? Yes, there are these people, right, who are quite far away from the transmitting station who can't receive special programming. Now, what happens during the period 94 to 96? We get these nice looking uh, these new additional transmitting stations, and if some of them start to come up over here, so even though we've not increased the people per radio, we now have more people who can receive special programming. Does that address your question, Nikhil? And which is what choice A is saying, or which is what choice is preventing. Actually, I shouldn't say it's saying. Nikhil, you there? Okay, the diagram gives clarity. Perfect. That is great. All right. And again, this is the visualization. And the thing which is there with regards to pre-thinking is it forces you to give that to visualize. And when it forces you to visualize, as you see the answer choices, you evaluate those answer choices in the context of that visualization. And that's when you get to the correct answer in difficult questions. Now, Shelby will refuse. Here I have a diagram which you guys will appreciate. A lot of you answered this correctly. The accuracy over here was 55%, which is good because this was a 700 level question. So let's look at what was happening last year. I want to make sure you guys understand this because this argument has a language that is beautiful. So last year, we collected some garbage. We did not recycle any of it. Every piece of garbage was incinerated. Incinerated means it was burned. Oh, sorry, incinerated means it was burned. This year, we collected some garbage. So just from a poll standpoint, how many cans of garbage were incinerated last year, or how many trucks? Let's assume that one can over here is equivalent to one truck. 10. Okay. So this year, what are we going to do? We're going to separate some cans for recycling and send the remaining for incineration. So how many cans are we sending this year for incineration? Or how many trucks? It will be 5 trucks. Okay. Now, here is my question. How many trucks do you think we'll send for incineration this year if if the amount of garbage collected this year is 10 times the amount of garbage collected last year? How many trucks do you think will send for incineration this year if the amount of garbage collected is 10 times of what it was last year? All right, let's get a few more responses. The question is, if I collect 10 times the garbage this year as I did last year, how many trucks am I going to send for incineration? 3, 2, and 1. Let me end the poll, broadcast the results. So, 33% of you think that the answer would be 5, and that would be correct. The answer is 5 trucks, regardless of whether you collect the same amount of garbage or you collect 10 times. 33% of you think it's going to be 50, 15% of you think it's going to be 100, and 11% of you think it's going to be 10 trucks. So let's see, why do I say it's going to be 5 trucks? Let's read their statement. This year, city services will separate for recycling enough refuse to reduce the number of truckloads of refuse to be incinerated to half of last year's number. So what this is saying is, and listen to this very carefully, what this is saying is that regardless of the amount of garbage or refuse that we collect this year, we are going to separate enough refuse so that you only get 5 trucks. If you got 10 trucks last year, you only get half as many trucks this year. So if you got 5 trucks last or 10 trucks last year, even if we collect 100 trucks worth of refuse, you are only going to get 5 trucks to incinerate. Can you guys see this? And that's very important to understand. Why? Because if you understand this, then what's the only thing that needs to be true for the conclusion to hold true? Or under what condition can you break the conclusion down? I'm going to The only thing that needs to be the way in which you'll break the conclusion down is under what conditions will the ash generated be greater than 50% if only half as many trucks are sent for incineration. The only possible scenario is if the ash generated per truckload is higher than what it was generated last year. So what is your assumption? Your assumption really is that the ash per truckload should be similar to or lower than what it was generated last year. Is everyone clear with that? 700 level question. Very, very simple thing once you understand and pre-think. Let's analyze the answer choices here. Choice A, why is this answer choice wrong? It satisfies a must be true condition, but it does not provide any new information. Because of which this is wrong. Why does it not provide new information? Because you can infer this from the argument that this year no material that is separated for recycling would be incinerated. Why? Because you separate for recycling and send the other material for incineration. Let's look at choice B. Choice B talks about the cost of separation. We don't care about the cost in my conclusion, so it is irrelevant. Choice C talks about the proportion of recyclable materials. Do we care about the proportion of recyclable materials? No, we don't. Why? Because we will only send half as many truckloads regardless of the proportion of recyclable materials. Okay. Choice D for delta, which is the correct answer, compares the ash per truckload this year versus the ash per truckload last year. Okay, which is in line with our pre-thinking. And if you see the negation test, If the ash per truckload is higher over here, as is there in the negated statement, what happens to my conclusion? My conclusion breaks down. Man, this presentation is killing my eyes. Choice E talks about the total quantity of refuse. Is that relevant? No. Why? Because we're only sending half as many truckloads. Again, you can negate this. You say total quantity of refuse would be greater this year than what it was last year. And you say, what is the impact? Again, Igon is there's no impact. Why? Because we are still sending half as many truckloads. So again, with that, we've come towards the end of this webinar. So how do you become this CR champ? What is the plan for you? Okay. One thing that you should understand is that when it comes to pre-thinking, it's not rocket science. I mean, we saw the process over here. Uh, every question that we solved had the same process, and if you follow that process, you come up with those scenarios which break the conclusion down, and then assumptions jump right at you. Okay, and as you use pre-thinking more and more, you're going to find that you are able to answer questions faster and you're able to answer more questions correctly. So how should you cement this approach? First of all, make sure that if you've not gone through the prerequisites, go through the prerequisites. Why? Because this will teach you how to do pre-thinking for various kinds of arguments. This is an introduction to assumption. Most of you are done with pretty much with that introduction to assumption in this webinar. But this now teaches you pre-thinking for two different kinds of segments. One is logical gap and the second is two entities, and it gives you a very specific practice quiz over here. So do that and it will help you cement this. If you're a new student, make sure you go through the course in a logical fashion. Get the foundation on premises and conclusion. Start with inference. Understand how statements are built and what you can infer from the statements. And in each of these modules, which is inference, assumption, evaluate, strengthen, weaken, and boldface, you'll go through the concept files, application concept quizzes, application files, practice quizzes, and official quizzes. Go through them. And at each point, you'll get feedback that is personalized to you. Once you do that, you can then practice more in Scholaranium. And to make the most out of this architecture, you've got to understand that the purpose behind building this architecture. This is an architecture which is built around a private tutoring environment where we teach you concepts, evaluate you on concepts right then and there. Once you learn a few concepts, we teach you how to apply those concepts and give you feedback on that. And then we have qualifying exercises in a confined fashion. We just don't have qualifying exercises for all of critical reasoning, which we do, but we also have qualifying exercises for assumption, for evaluate, for strengthen, for weaken, and so on and so forth. Look at this data that we provide, these analytics which we provide, and revise. If you revise, what you're going to find is that hitting that 700 plus or that 90th percentile becomes a lot easier. If you're a paid student, this is what your view looks like. Okay. And the beauty of this is that assumption is a very foundational module. It may seem like very long, but what you're learning is how are arguments constructed. So you have arguments that purely have logical gap. You have arguments where you have two entities and that a comparison is done. You have arguments that talk about segments. You have arguments that have pure comparison of multiple things in there, and you have quant focused arguments. And the reason why we've done this over here at this particular point is because once you know this, once you understand this, evaluate, strengthen, and weaken become very easily. Why? Because you're able to visualize all sorts of arguments that you're going to see in GMAT critical reasoning. So if you think about how this module is structured, you learn some basic concepts. This is level 1 application, level 2 application, and again, there is evaluation in all of these over here. So there's evaluation here, you get scores here, you get scores here, you get scores here, and you get scores here as well. And you have practice quizzes, which are official quizzes as well, in addition to the e-GMAT slated practice at each point in time over here. So how do students get to those 100 plus point score improvements? There are a few things that they do. They focus on learning pre-thinking. They don't time themselves while learning the process. Why? Because when you're learning the process, it's natural that you're gonna take slightly longer. Um, you can start to time yourself when you get into evaluate, but make sure you focus on learning pre-thinking now. Practice the official questions and ensure that in every concept quiz and every application file, you get to that 80th% score. And if you don't, revise that question, solve it again. And just that act of solving it again will help cement that approach, will help you avoid that mistakes. In the e-GMAT CR course, you're going to find upwards of 500 full-length questions. Now, how does this compare? This is almost 3 times as many questions as you're going to find in the official guide. And if you compare it against some of the other sources, you're going to find it's way more comprehensive. It's way more personal. This is the structure of modules that you would go through. With that, I've come to the end of this webinar. Here's an example of a student who was able to improve from V32 to V46, which is 99 percentile on GMAT verbal. And I think it's about 10 to 15 days or so. And the reason why she's able to do that is because she focused her energy on one section at a time, and she improved from there on. She received an admit from ISB within 10 days of applying. Acing GMAT CR isn't very difficult. If you spend about 10 days and a couple of days on assumptions, then a day each on evaluate, strengthen, weaken, you're going to find that by the time you hit that 10th day, and if you're diligent, if you spend a decent amount of time, you will start to hit that 80th percentile or higher. Okay, with that, I've come to the end of this webinar. It'd be great if you guys can provide me some feedback on the webinar in the short answer pod on the right hand side. I'll be happy to share the session handout as well. Okay. And again, if you have any other questions, you're welcome to pose those questions in the Q&A pod. Okay, guys, I would appreciate some feedback, and if you have questions, I'd be happy to answer those. Also, if you can put in your learnings from the webinar, I think it'll be very interesting for me. It'll be very interesting to others as well. One other thing, remember we still have 2 sessions that are upcoming. We have the algebra webinar tomorrow, and we also have the GMAT strategy webinar. So make sure that you register for them so that you receive the join links for these webinars. Elvira, yes. GMAT verbal is about logic. In fact, even quant's about logic, as you'll see in the algebra webinar tomorrow. If you are and being a manager is about being logical while making decisions as well. So all right. Yes, pre-thinking is a bit painful. Anything that you do for the first time is going to be painful. Okay. But yes, it is tremendously helpful. It's tremendously satisfying. And it requires persistence. I will tell you that. Is this webinar available on demand? Yes, I mean you can, for the free webinars, you can actually watch the recordings on our YouTube channel, and we'll send the recording of this particular webinar as well. Let me send you the link to our YouTube channel and see a few hundred videos uploaded over there. So definitely watch the recording there. Kumar says, Utkar says, I've scored V38 using e-GMAT, but I need to improve more in CR. How should you do that? Utkar, send an email to rajat@gmat and we'll send you areas. We'll look at your account, look at the data, and send you insights as to how you can improve. Pedro says at NCR, is it better to pre-decide the answer using pre-thinking or eliminate the wrong answer choices? Pedro, pre-decide the answer using pre-thinking is what my position is. Complex answer choices, yeah. So Piyush, if you're facing issues with complex answer choices, you need to go through the inference module. Why? Because it explains how do you simplify complex statements, and that will help you a lot. All right, guys. With that, I want to thank everyone for joining me today. It was really wonderful uh, interacting with you guys and hosting this webinar. And I want to thank you for participating as well. I mean, we got 70 plus pre-thinking responses for some arguments. That was phenomenal. So study well, keep up this enthusiasm, and I'll see you on egmat.com as well as in our next webinar.